Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New York Historical Society. I'm Louise Mirror, President and CEO at the Society. Tonight's program, Angels and Ages, Darwin, Lincoln, and Modern Life, is part of the Bernard and Irene Schwartz Distinguished Speakers Series, the heart of our public programs. As always, I'd like to thank Mr. and Mrs. Schwartz for their very generous support, which has enabled us to bring so many fine speakers and historians to this society. Tonight's program is about parallel lives, an extraordinary, lasting influence of two men who were born on the same day in 1809, Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln. The program is part of our series celebrating the 200th anniversary of Lincoln's birth. The program will last about an hour, and it will include a question and answer session if time permits. Following the program, please do join us for a reception and book signing with our guest, whose book you may purchase for a special program night discount in our museum store. Adam Gopnik has been writing for The New Yorker since 1986. In that time, he's written everything from fiction and humor to book reviews and art criticism. His work has earned him the National Magazine Award for Essay and the George Polk Award for Magazine Reporting. He's the author of several books, including Paris to the Moon, a collection of essays from his time living in the City of Light, the adventure novel The King in the Window, and most recently, Angels and Ages, a short book about Darwin, Lincoln, and modern life. He's broadcasted regularly for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and wrote an article on American culture for the last two editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Before we begin, as always, I'd like to ask that you please make sure your cell phones are switched off. And now, please join me in welcoming Adam Gopnik to the New York Historical Society.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be speaking at the New York Historical Society. This has long been one of my favorite places in New York, and in the long lost days when I was actually a practicing art critic, I used to come here and actually wrote both about the Audubon collection and about the wonderful collection of Tiffany lamps, both of which seem to me high points in the history of American design, American art in the broadest sense. And if I ever get the book written on American art, which I am now 25 years late in delivering to the publisher, I will include both of those pieces and both of those collections in a prominent place, but don't hold your breath. I wanted to talk to you tonight about this book, obviously, but more broadly and more significantly, I hope, about these two men, their example, their rhetoric, their diction, their way of talking, their way of seeing the world, Darwin and Lincoln. And I also want, if I might, to talk a little bit about attacks, critiques that are made of these two men that you still see around, which I deal with lightly in what was meant to be a short book, an essayistic book, but which I might deal with at a little greater length, if you'll tolerate it, tonight. And finally, I want, if I can, to suggest why these two lives are still of such searching significance for us in the world. I've just come back from London, where I introduced the book, or tried to introduce the book at least, to British readers. And it was funny and touching because, of course, whereas in this country, Lincoln is an icon who we stare at every day on the penny and the $5 bill, Darwin is a slightly more remote figure. In England, Darwin is the icon who they stare at every day on the 10-pound note, and Lincoln is the rather obscure figure. So I found myself in a kind of world-turned-upside-down situation where the interviewers on the radio were saying, "We don't know very much about Mr. Lincoln in this country," and trying to explain things that seem to Americans very basic. So if I seem to be doing elementary work on Lincoln, it's simply because I am still in some state of mental jet lag back in the old country. Darwin and Lincoln were born on the same day, February 12th, 1809. And my meditation on these two lives and the first steps in this book began when I realized, after having been in love with both men for much of my adult life and in love with their writing and their speaking, when I realized that they did share this remarkable and cosmic coincidence of having been born on February 12th, 1809. And what interested me about that was not simply the cosmic coincidence, because coincidence, I think, is not something we should overlook. Coincidence is the vernacular of history. It's the kind of first slang that makes us pay attention to larger patterns. When we think, for instance, of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams dying on the same day, and that day would be July the 4th, though it is simply a coincidence, nonetheless it makes us brood on the rituals of the new republic, why these two men willed themselves, as aging people will, to stay alive until that day, until that anniversary. Darwin and Lincoln being born on opposite sides of the ocean the same day is simply one of those coincidences, but it is a coincidence that makes us reflect on the fabric and the warp and woof of modern life itself, because when we reflect on what the world was like when these two men had passed away from it, we see, I think, a fundamental change, a fulcrum, a watershed, a transformation, not just in history, but in human consciousness. In 1809, when both of these men are born in radically different circumstances, Lincoln, of course, in poverty, extreme rural poverty in Kentucky, Darwin in great middle-class comfort in England. In 1809, the world has, on the whole, certain characteristics. People believe, for instance, that democracy, republicanism, the organized practice of majority rule is, if not doomed, then at least wildly precarious and difficult. And of course, there's the instant example of the revolution in France to make people feel that way. A French Revolution, if you're looking at it in 1809, is a story, to use Lincoln's later words, of how a bid for liberty declines into first anarchy and then into tyranny. Napoleon is still the leader of France at that point, and it is very easy to see, as Edmund Burke and so many others did, very easy to believe that all democracy contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that democracy in itself is a self-annihilating movement. That had been the history of democratic movements from the British Revolution right up to the French Revolution, and even the American Revolution, which seemed to have established a democracy, a working and living democracy in the United States, nonetheless seemed terribly precarious, not least because it contained the unannealable institution of slavery. Remember that when de Tocqueville comes here in the 1820s, with all of the enormous sympathy he has for the American experiment, he concludes at the end that this experiment is unlikely to last, that the internal contradictions of America are likely to tear it apart before it can become established. Darwin, on the other side of the ocean, remember his grandfathers were radicals in the north of England. There's a wonderful book which I urge you all to read by Jenny Uglow called The Lunar Men, which is an account of the life of Darwin's grandfathers, along with several other political radicals in the north of England as the Industrial Revolution is beginning, as the next phase of the scientific revolution is beginning. And this is a wonderful moment of Renaissance, which ends quite brutally as reaction sets in England, and Joseph Priestley is literally burned out of his house, and the next generation of Darwins and Wedgwoods become much more quiescent in their political claims. Democracy seems to be something that's very unlikely ever to be permanently established. It's a shocking idea for us because we use the language of democracy all the time, even when we don't mean it, even when we use it insincerely, even when we use it ineffectively. We take it for granted that people believe that in some sense democratic, republican, liberal, in the broad sense, liberal societies are here to stay. People didn't think that in 1809. And in a broader sense, when we think about nature, the conviction, and again, hard for us to take it in because it's so alien to our way of thinking, the conviction broadly was that the forms of life were fixed in place and had always been fixed in place, that there was no transition between species, that there had been one moment, perhaps, of common creation on what was still thought to be a relatively young Earth. Now, there are lots of exceptions to that rule, and no time has completely monolithic thought. Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, for instance, had written a long poem proposing an evolutionary sequence for the history of life. But exactly the point was that kind of speculation belonged to the world of fancy, not to the world of established fact. That's what the mental picture of the world was like.